All right, so this video is on topic 710, the New Deal, which is all about how this guy, who is responsibly wearing his mask during the COVID outbreak, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, tried to deal with the Great Depression. So, in the last video, we talked about the causes and effects of the Great Depression, and I went over Hoover's response to the Great Depression. Hoover gets a bad rap. Um, he has those shanty towns named Hoovervilles after him, and we often think he was a poor president. One thing that to note about Hoover is that up to that point, Herbert Hoover did more to try to alleviate the Great Depression than any president before him had tried to do in previous depressions. So he had actually done more than any previous politician, but it was not enough. So let's find out what Franklin Roosevelt did and what this thing is that he calls the New Deal. So the objective here in learning about the New Deal is to be able to explain how the Great Depression and the New Deal impacted American political, social, and economic life over time. So we're looking at changes, ways that this time period, the Depression and New Deal, changed American politics. How does it change economic life? How does it change social life? So if we're looking at historical developments, there's four major historical developments to note. So the first one is something called Roosevelt's 3 Rs. So Roosevelt's New Deal attempted to end the Great Depression by using government power to provide relief to the poor, stimulate recovery, and reform the American economy. So this is something called the 3 Rs, and we're going to talk about them in a little bit more detail. The second big historical development is that there was a lot of pressure on Roosevelt to do different things. So radical union and populist movements pushed Roosevelt towards more extensive efforts to change the American economic system. So Roosevelt, we're going to see, is a bit of a moderate compared to some of these radical or populist movements. And at the same time, conservatives in both Congress and the Supreme Court are going to work to limit the New Deal's scope. So politics as usual here. The third item is that although the New Deal does not end the Depression, and it's important to note that the New Deal will not solve the problems of the Depression, it does leave a legacy of reforms and regulatory agencies and have fostered a long-term political realignment. This realignment is called the New Deal Coalition. So this is a coalition in which many ethnic groups, African Americans, and working class communities like labor unions and the working, like blue collar workers, are going to identify long term with the Democratic Party. So Roosevelt's election in 1932 is a major realignment in the political party system. If we were in my classroom, this would be where one of those blue strips is on the wall showing a realignment or change in political party. Okay, and then the last big historical development to note and learn about during this New Deal is that the increased demand for war production as we move to the end of the 1930s and World War II is beginning. So the increased demand for war production and labor during World War II and the economic difficulties of the 1930s led many Americans to migrate to urban centers in search of economic opportunity. So again, a continuing urbanization of the United States. So these would be the big four. And then as you listen, you want to be figuring out some specific historical items that go under each one of these big four historical developments. So I want to start out by telling you a little bit about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man. So we have this image here, and it's not incredibly clear, but we have an image of Roosevelt here. He's laughing and gregarious, and this is how he came across to many of the American people. He is the only child of a wealthy New York family. So he didn't have siblings, anything like that. He had a long, extensive background in political service. So he had served in both elected positions and appointed positions. So some major ones prior to him becoming president. He was in the New York legislature, elected to the New York legislature. He was appointed as the U.S. Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And then right before presidency, during the years that Hoover was president, FDR was the governor of New York State. So he had a long political career. He, as a young man, as a rising star, he contracted polio in 1921 and was paralyzed. And this was right after he had been on the Democratic ticket in the election of 1920 as the vice presidential candidate. So he was a politician of national note in 1920. He contracted polio in 1921 and he was paralyzed. He eventually gained back the use of his upper body, but he was never able to walk or stand unassisted after this. So he relied on a wheelchair. He had to have metal braces on his legs. And so this photograph shows him seated. And this is how the American people generally saw him. He was seated in a car behind a table, anything like that. And what I find extremely interesting is that Roosevelt, the press agreed to hide the fact that President Roosevelt was paralyzed from the American people. So a lot of the American people did not know that he was paralyzed while he was president. And this was just a tacit agreement on the part of the press. They didn't want to do anything that would make the president appear weak or unable to carry out his duties as president. And then in his personal life, he was married to Eleanor Roosevelt. So she's the niece of Theodore Roosevelt. So her maiden name is Roosevelt. Her married name is Roosevelt. Um, they are related, but very distantly. So I'll show you what that relation is. But she became one of the most active first ladies in U.S. history. She established a name for herself, independent of her husband, of a person of historical note. Um, on a personal level, their marriage was not good. FDR was not faithful to Eleanor Roosevelt. And so by the time he became president, their personal relationship was very strained, but they did have a mutual respect for one another. And many people consider her the conscience, the social conscience of FDR. If we're looking at relation, this is the Roosevelt family tree here. So you can see it goes back quite a ways to where they have a common, like uh, first generation or like primary relationship. So we have two brothers in the late 1600s, and then we have the Hyde Park branch of the Roosevelt family tree, which is Franklin Delano Roosevelt's, and then we have the other branch of the family tree. And so you can see here is President Theodore Roosevelt, and then Theodore Roosevelt's brother Elliot was the father of Eleanor Roosevelt, who married Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But you can see that there are a number of generations between here. So although they have the same last name, they are distant cousins. Like not too close, right? Nothing too weird here. Okay, this is what Roosevelt looked like in his private life, right? So he's sitting in his wheelchair here, and this is widely understood by the American public today, but like I said, not widely understood. So the images that the American people would have seen of this man would have been Roosevelt seated in a car, like here, or maybe Roosevelt behind his desk. So this is the image many people have. His personality, he's was known to be affable, enjoyable to be around. Um, so he used that to his advantage in his political career. So when he was elected and on his inauguration in 1933, this image, this cover of the New Yorker magazine, is taken from a photograph that was taken of these two men. So we have FDR sitting in the car, smiling, waving to the inauguration crowds. And then we have Herbert Hoover riding next to him, and you can see that his face is angry. He's upset. This is you can find a lot of photographs like this, right? So Hoover was leaving, and many people considered him a failure, and they were ready to hear from Roosevelt. This actually led to the 20th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. This is called the Lame Duck Amendment. Um, Roosevelt was elected in November of 1932, and then there was a months long waiting period before he could become president. So um, the amendment was passed by Congress in 1933 that moved the inauguration from the first week of March up to January 20th. So it didn't, you can see here that Roosevelt was inaugurated on March 4th, 1933, but in all later presidential elections, the presidents are ratified on January 20th. And that's to reduce the amount of time spent for a lame duck president, because Hoover had lost the election. He did not seem able to do much to help people during the Great Depression. And he even offered to work with FDR during the lame duck presidency, but FDR declined. He didn't want to be tied to any of Hoover's policies. So FDR said, no, I'll just wait until I'm inaugurated. So in February of 1933, that amendment's passed by Congress. It was ratified in October 1933. So from that point forward, inauguration moved from March, first week of March, to January 20th. When Roosevelt was giving his inauguration speech, he told the American people, he said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And he said, things are already terrible, basically. Things are already bad. So the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So let's try whatever we can to get this going. And he promised or let 3 R's kind of direct his policy, right? He wanted relief for the American people. So things like money, jobs, housing, food. He wanted relief for the American people. He wanted recovery for the economy. So this would be like lessening the unemployment rate, getting banks back open, so getting the economy functioning and recovered. And then the third thing he sought was reform. We need to reform the system so nothing like this can happen again. So Roosevelt had his 3 R's to direct him, and he did something that was fairly new as president. He had a brain trust that he used. So he appointed a cabinet, but he also had a group of advisors that he called his brain trust to help him form the policies and programs of the first New Deal. So this brain trust is people who, academics, professors, experts in economics, experts in banking and business, that were going to help him and tell him the best ways to accomplish his 3 R's. So on day one, the American people already are feeling more optimistic. They feel like Roosevelt is ready to address the Great Depression in ways that Hoover was unable and unwilling to do. So what we see basically is there's 2 different philosophies. So we have on this left side here, this is Hoover's philosophy of how he was going to help the economy. So Hoover did try to directly stimulate the economy. And by directly stimulate, I mean he tried to put money into the US economy directly from the government to try to get it running. But he used what we call supply side economics, or it's often referred to as trickle down economics. So he put his money into the upper levels of the economy, right? He made loans to big business. And then his expectation is that those loans would trickle down to the average worker. Roosevelt took a different approach, right? And this is called demand side economics or Keynesian economics. Now, this word Keynesian is really important. It's part of a last name. There's a British economist at the time in the 1930s. His name is John Maynard Keynes. And he said instead of using supply side economics and putting money in the top levels of the economy, you had to infuse money into the lower levels. So this is called priming the pump. Demand side economics or Keynesian economics. But the idea with FDR is he would inject money into the lowest levels of the economy, directly into people's pockets and bank accounts. So this would take the form of direct payments or jobs programs from the government. So temporary jobs. The government would have things like infrastructure projects where they're building bridges and dams. And the American people would work on these jobs, get their paychecks, and then start spending that money. So that new money goes into circulation, which is going to increase demand, which will lead businesses to investing um, in new ideas or open new businesses, expand their plants, create new jobs, new profits. And so the idea is that this would continue to cycle up through the economy. So as long as people had money to spend, the thought of Roosevelt and John Maynard Keynes is that then people would be, if they're spending money in the economy would improve. So we see two different philosophies. So the New Deal is based on these ideas of John Maynard Keynes. Roosevelt immediately got to work as president. And in the first 100 days of his presidency, he enacted a staggering amount of new programs and laws for the first 100 days. And we now use this measure in our politics um, to evaluate new presidents. So every time there's a new president, there's talk of what is this president going to accomplish in their first 100 days. Um, so Roosevelt, Roosevelt, one of his first actions was to declare a bank holiday. We're going to talk a little bit more about this. A repeal of prohibition. He felt that prohibition was just basically a drain on the federal treasury. With alcohol being manufactured illegally, that meant the government wasn't regulating and taxing that money. In addition, the government was spending money to enforce the law, and it was just very unpopular. So, repeal of prohibition. The law was passed through Congress to repeal prohibition in Roosevelt's first 100 days, and then it was ratified later in 1933. So that became the 21st Amendment. Roosevelt enacted numerous relief, recovery, and reform programs, and he also engaged in fireside chats where he would speak directly to the American people. He would get on the radio because there's no television yet, and he would address the American people directly. And all of the national radio broadcasts would carry these. So this is an image of Roosevelt during one of his fireside chats. So he's seated at his desk, he has his speech, and you have all of these microphones in front of him for the different radio stations. And he would do this weekly. Every Sunday evening, he would speak to the American people, and he did this through the Great Depression, and he continued doing it during World War II. As time carried on, it was not always every single week, but he would take his message directly to the American people, and families would sit down by their radios and sit next to their fire and listen to him chat, right? So fireside chats. When we're looking at New Deal programs for Roosevelt, and it's not really important to understand where the programs fell in, but we have the first New Deal, which was the first 100 days. And then in 1935, he began working on a second New Deal. So the first 100 days, a number of programs were passed, and they were addressing relief, recovery, and reform. So we have the Emergency Banking Act, and these are all like letters. We call these like alphabet soup or alphabet laws. So Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, Securities and Exchange Commission. So we have a number of these alphabet programs. And then the second New Deal was based more on relief and recovery, less on reform. So I kind of want to go through a few of these, but this is a cartoon kind of criticizing Roosevelt, saying, he's just trying whatever he can think of, right? So he's has his bag here of New Deal remedies as a doctor. Congress is his nurse. And he says, of course, we may have to change remedies if we don't get results, right? And so we have all these different programs serving as the medicine. So Roosevelt really, he's using the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, but this is the first time somebody had really tried this. So there are some programs passed during the New Deal that didn't help. There's other programs that were much more successful. And Roosevelt was open to saying, we're just going to try. We might have to try something else if that doesn't work. Okay, probably one of the most impactful and important of Roosevelt's New Deal programs is the Emergency Banking Act, or the bank holiday. This bank holiday was a program where Roosevelt closed all of the banks in the country. And this occurred in the first few days of his presidency. He gave his first fireside chat and he told the American people, we will close all of the banks in the United States for a bank holiday. And then federal auditors are going to look at the books, they're going to inspect the banks, and only the banks that are healthy will be able to reopen. So probably about 4 out of 5 of the banks nationally were able to reopen after this bank holiday. But about 20% of the banks in the United States did not reopen after this banking holiday. And what Roosevelt achieved by doing this was he was able to stabilize the banking industry and restore the public trust and confidence in banks. People were willing to put their money back into the banks. They weren't afraid that the banks were going to close because they had been told these banks have been inspected. These banks are healthy. If they reopen, you are safe to put your money in. And then in addition, another program passed during the New Deal is the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, which prohibited banks from trading in the stock market because there were a number of banks that had been trading in the stock market or giving loans out for stock purchases. And that's one of the reasons some of them were insolvent. When the stock market crashed or lost its value, the banks were overextended. So it prohibited them from trading in stocks, but it also establishes the FDIC, or Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insured people's deposits in the bank up to $5,000. So if the bank failed, this FDIC insurance would make sure that people did not lose all of their deposits. And we still have the FDIC insurance today. Today, banks are insured up to accounts are insured up to $250,000. So as long as you are putting your money into an FDIC insured bank, you're insured up to $250,000 per account, just in case that bank fails. He also created the Securities and Exchange Commission, which monitored the stock markets, and it enforces the Truth in Securities Act, which requires companies to provide accurate information to investors. So a company can't lie to an investor to try to get their money. And then the last one here that we want to look at is NIRA, National Industrial Recovery Act. And NIRA created codes of fair competition between businesses and fair wages for workers. So basically, things like minimum wages. It legalized unions. So all of these programs were aimed at reforming the system, trying to make sure that some of the weaknesses of the economy were regulated so that something like the Great Depression could not occur again. NIRA was eventually found to be unconstitutional. There's parts of it that still remain, but as a whole, NIRA was found to be unconstitutional. Okay, there were also programs aimed at different sectors of the economy. So we have the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA, which was meant to aid farmers. The idea here is they're going to reduce crop production. So the government was going to get involved and they're going to reduce production. So basically, they were paying farmers to leave some of their fields empty, which would decrease the quantity of a crop supplied, which should then increase the price of the product. So they're trying to address the overproduction of farming. FDR also designed the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. And what this was is a program that would hire young men between about 18 to 25 to go out and work. They would work in CCC camps. So they would go and live in these camps. It was a barrack style camp. They would work on conservation projects for the US government. The CCC was absolutely essential to basically building the Olympic Peninsula. So things like Squim Bay State Park was built by the CCC, the Hurricane Ridge Visitor Center, the road up to Hurricane Ridge, most of our fire roads. These things were all built by the CCC, and we had CCC camps all over the Olympic Peninsula. So the Slab Camp was a CCC camp. The Elwha Ranger Station, if you drive up along the Elwha River, was a CCC camp. There was a small one on Luella Road by Squim Bay that was open in the summers, and that's where the young men lived that were building Squim Bay State Park. So any kind of like hiking, if you do hiking around here, or campgrounds, or you visit some of the national park sites, um, there's a very good chance that initially that was built by the CCC. And the idea here was these young men were paid $30 a month. They got to keep 5 of it for themselves, and $25 went home to their families to help support their families. And then while they were living in the camp, their food, their clothing, their living expenses were all paid by the US government. So this one was very successful. And I have a film that I'll post for you to take a look at on the CCC. But it really helps you understand how these New Deal programs were supposed to work. We have things like FERA, which granted federal money to states to fund relief projects. So this would be giving money to states so that they could give unemployment benefits, or they could provide food and housing, whatever the state needed for relief. And then another big program is the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, which the federal government funded the building of dams and hydroelectric dams in the Tennessee Valley. So that's a region of the country that had been underdeveloped. They didn't have electricity, for example, in the 1930s. So these southern states that are kind of interior from the coast, so places like Tennessee and Kentucky, they were provided power by the federal government through the building of these dams and power plants. So there's a number of programs that were created. This is just a few of them, but the idea is this money is going directly into the pockets of the people. These were really pretty popular in the United States. So if we look at the election of 1936, which is FDR's first re-election campaign, he won more states than he won in 1932. And if you remember, in 1932, he absolutely trounced Herbert Hoover. He had something like 88% of the electoral vote. And then now in 1936, he gets 98% of the electoral vote. So these programs were extremely popular with the American people. They were providing relief. People were feeling better. They were feeling more hopeful as the New Deal programs were put into place. Okay, some of the second New Deal programs, these were later programs that were meant to help address some reform and relief in the country. But one of the major ones is the Work Progress Administration, which was like the CCC, but it's more urban. So it's a work program for people in the urban areas. It wasn't targeted just to young men. So older people, unemployed people could find work, and it put people to work in all different kinds of fields. So if there were like plumbers that are unemployed. They would be put to work doing some kind of plumbing projects, either like at a park or in public buildings, carpentry, masonry. A lot of the sidewalks in the United States initially were put in during the Great Depression. And you can find, if you go into like the old part of cities, you can find stamps on the corner of the sidewalk that say WPA, Works Progress Administration. Photographers. So Dorothea Lange, the woman who took the migrant mother picture, she was hired by the WPA to work as a photographer. So this was a program that took people and used the skills they already had and put them to work. Um, the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act, was an act to serve as a Bill of Rights for organized labor, and it gave unions the right to organize and bargain collectively. So we see that union membership in the 1920s had declined to about 1 in 10 workers. But now, with this National Labor Relations Act, union membership swelled again in the 1930s. And we see like a resurgence of union activity. And then this last one, the Social Security Act, this is still in place today. This creates a social insurance program for the elderly. The idea is that as you work, some of your money is held out in taxes. It goes into an account. It doesn't pay for your retirement, but it does, it funds a Social Security system. So right now, my job and my work, the taxes taken out for Social Security, are funding people who are retired and on Social Security right now. When I retire, you all will fund my retirement through Social Security, but it really is meant to provide two benefits. A retirement pension for the elderly, and then it's a social insurance program for those that are disabled and cannot work. So this one is solidly still around, but remember I talked about Roosevelt being so popular that there was a New Deal coalition, a new group of people who began to support Roosevelt. And so this cartoon shows this idea. So this cartoon from the 1930s shows Roosevelt standing, and remember, he wouldn't have been standing, but it shows Roosevelt standing, shaking hands with the forgotten man. So this is labor and the working class, those who feel like government had not ever served them before. So for the first time, this lower class group of people feel like the government is in place to serve and help them, which is one of the reasons why Roosevelt was so popular. But not everybody likes Roosevelt. Oh, sorry, I forgot. This is here. This is some of the CCC workers out working on one of their conservation programs. Okay, if we're looking at the impact of the New Deal, when we look at, and I know this graphic is a little cut off, but if we're looking at the impact, we can see that in some areas there's great improvement, in others there's not as much. So gross national product, this is a measurement of how much an economy is producing, right? So product or production. So when we're looking at gross national product, 1926 and 1929, which were prosperous years, the U.S. economy was producing around $100 billion worth of product a year. And then we can see in 1933, which is the worst year of the Great Depression, the U.S. economy was producing just over half of what it had been producing in years previous. And then from 1939, we see it start to increase. And then in 1943, this is World War II, almost double what the US economy had been making in the 1920s. So we can see gross national product is improving, but one of the historical processes or developments that you're supposed to take away from this is that the New Deal did not end the Depression. And so if we're looking here, by 1939, the US is doing better, but had not gotten back to the same production levels that it was at 10 years earlier. So if the US had recovered over the course of 10 years, the US economy should probably be producing just a little bit more than it had been producing in the 1920s. And then we see from World War II, the production had doubled. So it really is World War II that took the United States out of the Great Depression. But there were improvements from the New Deal. So if we look over here at business failures in the upper right, um, there's quite a few business failures even in 1926, right? So we see a number of business failures, and that number is cut in half by 1937. So the New Deal um, did make it easier for businesses to be successful. We see that unemployment did decline um, from the New Deal. So the peak unemployment of 25% in 1933, it was down to 14% by 1937, back up in 1938 to 19%. So again, unemployment had not been solved by the New Deal. But with World War II, we see that unemployment is virtually zero. Um, Anything under 2% is considered full employment. And then the debt. If we look at the bottom left, the government debt soared. So the takeaway when we're looking at all of these graphics here is the New Deal and the ideas of John Maynard Keynes. It was not enough to end the Depression, but World War II did. So, what a lot of people say is that Keynes was correct. John Maynard Keynes was correct. The government needed to spend. But they say, even with all the programs of the New Deal, there was not enough spending. The stimulus needed to be even greater than what people had than what was happening with the New Deal. So that's why John Maynard Keynes says the World War II was the stimulus event that really pulled the world out of depression. You can look up a lot of different information on that. There's still conflicting ideas of whether this stimulus spending and pump priming practices of John Maynard Keynes are a good idea. But we do see that one thing that comes out of it is debt. But what's interesting is the debt comes from the war, not the New Deal, not as much. And I'll show you some more on that as well. Okay, so Roosevelt does have critics. Okay, in the 1930s, even though he's winning re-election by an unprecedented amount, he does have critics. So there are people that do not like his programs, and he has critics on both the liberal and the conservative side. So people who think he is not liberal enough, and people that think he is too liberal. And we want to look at a few of these critics because some of these critics push Roosevelt into some of those New Deal programs. So if we're looking, Roosevelt is he's a big fan of metaphors. And so for the Great Depression, one of the metaphors he uses is that of a tree. And he says, say that civilization is a tree. As it grows, continually produce rot and dead wood. The radical says, cut it down. The conservative says, don't touch it. And the liberal compromises. Let's prune so that we lose neither the old trunk or the new branches. This campaign is waged to teach the country to march upon its appointed course, avoiding alike the revolution of radicalism and the revolution of conservatism. So the way that Roosevelt kind of addressed these critics was he placed himself in the middle. And he said, we don't want to be too radical. We don't need to cut down the whole system and start over. And we also don't need to let it sit and rot and not deal with the issues. So he says, what we do is we need to cut out the parts that are unhealthy, and then everything else will become more healthy, right? So he puts himself in the center, and he's pretty good at doing this. He uses these metaphors to speak to the American people. So this comes from one of his campaign speeches, saying, "We don't want to do this. You know, we don't want to cut the tree down. We don't want to just let this whole system sit here and decay and rot as well." So the liberal critics of the New Deal, these are people who are extreme, right? So socialists or extreme liberals, communists, people who might recommend like reallocation of wealth, for example. They criticize the New Deal for doing too much for businesses and not enough for the unemployed or working poor. And these liberal critics charge that the president failed to address the problems of minorities, women, and the elderly, which to an extent are true. But Roosevelt did extend many of his programs to minorities where predecessors would not have, for example. So it is true, there is not equality. Okay, and then we have conservative critics of the New Deal, and they are more numerous, right? There's more conservative critics of Roosevelt than there are liberal critics. They say that Roosevelt is giving the federal government too much power. The government is getting too big. The programs like the Work Progress Administration and the Wagner Act are bordering on socialism, maybe even communism. So there is a lot of opposition. Their main concern or concerns are the increased spending business regulations. So again, remember the conservative viewpoint to this up to now had been laissez-faire economics. So they don't like seeing all these increased business regulations. The conservative critics don't like the pro-union stance of Roosevelt, especially in the Second New Deal. They feel like it gives unions too much power to demand concessions, like shorter work days or minimum wage, for example. And they really don't like the deficit spending. So they feel like government should not spend more than it makes, right? They want a balanced budget. Roosevelt would counter this balanced budget by saying in 1937 he tried to have a more balanced spending. And we see in 1937 the economy began sliding back into depression again. So Roosevelt would say, no, deficit spending is necessary. Okay, so this would be a conservative critique of Roosevelt, right? Saying, pulling the rabbit out of the hat, government spending has never failed me. So there's plenty of conservative critique. Okay, this is another conservative critique of Roosevelt. So it's using the story of the Trojan horse. And it's saying that in bringing these New Deal programs are creating a kind of government tyranny in society. So we're going to sneak tyranny into the Constitution of the United States, much like the Trojan horse. We're hiding this tyranny in New Deal programs. Okay, some of Roosevelt's criticism came from people we would call demagogues. And demagogues are people who are able to get a lot of populist support. So in those historical developments, these are the populist movements that push Roosevelt. A demagogue is a leader who seeks support by appealing to popular desires and prejudices rather than using rational or logical argument. So rather than explaining how something works, a demagogue is likely to use a quick catchphrase that might play on people's fears or an oversimplified solution. And demagogues often use half truths and they give large, wild promises in order to gain power. So some of these demagogues in this time period, the first one is someone named Father Charles Coughlin. And he's a Catholic priest. He had a radio show, so he's called the Radio Priest. And he called for issuing an inflated currency and nationalizing all of the banks. So he wants the banks to be owned and operated by the US government, basically. And he was very, very popular. So Roosevelt was getting pressure to take control and nationalize the banks. But as Charles Coughlin continued to speak and do his radio show, he began to be more anti-Semitic and fascist. Until up to the point where the Catholic Church or his superiors told him he has to stop his broadcasts. So Father Charles Coughlin is one of these demagogues. Second one is a man named Dr. Francis Townsend. And Francis Townsend proposed he wanted it's a little bit like a reallocation of wealth. He wanted a 2% federal sales tax to create a fund that would provide every retired person over the age of 60 $200 a month. So this is kind of like Social Security. So this is an example where a demagogue, or Dr. Townsend, was able to push Roosevelt towards a program similar. So Roosevelt, this is where Roosevelt put in Social Security as a system rather than this 2% sales tax. So the Social Security system only taxes people who work, not everybody who buys something, right? So it's more moderate than this 2% sales tax. And then the amount that the retired get was less than in value than this 200 a month would have been. But this is an example where a populist movement kind of pushed Roosevelt towards a different kind of plan. Probably the most influential of the demagogues is someone named Huey Long, who was a senator from Louisiana. And Huey Long was a Democrat. So he's a demagogue who was on the other side of Roosevelt. And he proposed something called Share Our Wealth. And this is a plan that would promise a minimum annual income of $5,000 for every family, and it would be paid for by taxing the wealthy. Now, this $5,000, if I put it in my currency calculator on my phone, would be equal to something like $85,000 to $90,000 today. So this was significant. Roosevelt saw him as the most dangerous of these Depression demagogues because his ideas were quite popular with people. There was a lot of push and sentiment towards socialism or communism during the Great Depression. So Huey Long was going to challenge Roosevelt for the presidential nomination in 1936, but he was killed in 1935 by an assassin. And before you guys think this was some kind of inside job on the part of Roosevelt, this assassin that killed Huey Long, he was a lone wolf conservative person who got so inflamed at Huey Long's idea of reallocating wealth that he decided to kill Huey Long rather than have this person potentially become the leader of the United States. So the assassin actually was somebody of a conservative persuasion, not somebody hired by FDR. Okay, the last group that Roosevelt fought with was the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in the 1930s was pretty conservative. So a number of his New Deal plans had been declared unconstitutional. So, for example, NERA and the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or AAA, was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So Roosevelt had an idea or a plan to fix this. This is something called the Court Reorganization Plan, or that was the official name, Court Reorganization Plan, or they called it the Court Packing Plan, because Roosevelt was going to add additional judges to the Supreme Court. So he was going to appoint liberal justices and pack the court until the majority of the court shifted from conservative to liberal. So under FDR's plan, he called the Supreme Court the Nine Old Men. And so his plan was to appoint an additional justice for every Supreme Court judge that was 70 and a half years old. And if you remember, Supreme Court judges are appointed for life. So Roosevelt doesn't have the option of removing these judges. So this is why he was going to appoint up to 6 more judges under this plan. Okay, so here's our image of the nine old men with their horse and buggy mentality, as Roosevelt put it. So as he tried to go through with this court packing plan, here's Roosevelt's perspective, right? I'm sorry I can't help you, but the Supreme Court says I must chuck you back in, right? So he's throwing this guy back into the Depression. Okay, and Roosevelt thinks, well, maybe if we just slip it past the Supreme Court, we can get by. And the Supreme Court will, they're blocking their plans. So he says, well, the Supreme Court judges seem kind of old. Maybe we should give them some practical assistance, right? Let's just give them some help. So Roosevelt proposes this plan to Congress. And Congress at the time has a Democratic majority. So Congress, he thinks Congress is going to side with him. But the idea seems like such an overreach. So if we look at this, the idea seems like such an overreach of power that the Democratic Congress actually blocks Roosevelt and says, Roosevelt, we can't, this goes too far, right? We can't violate the Constitution this way. What's interesting about this is the Constitution does not limit or state how many Supreme Court judges there can be. The president, all it says is that the president nominates Supreme Court judges. But through practice, the United States had had 9 Supreme Court judges for a few decades at this point, and that had just become the accepted number. So Roosevelt wasn't violating the Constitution in appointing additional judges, but he was violating political norms and standards. And the Senate, which would have been the body that would have confirmed these judges, Senate says, if he's going to add additional judges, what's next? Is he going to be able to affect the power of the Senate, right? Is there some way he's going to try to pack the Senate? So this is an example of a check on power of Roosevelt. He was going to try to appoint the extra judges, and Congress says, no, that goes too far. Okay, so the idea of packing the court is shelved, and just like Napoleon lost at Waterloo, FDR loses some of his political power in this court packing plan. From this point forward, he's not as overwhelmingly popular as a candidate. Okay, if we're looking at the New Deal, there are some legacies of the New Deal. The idea of priming the pump, or Keynesian economics, has become a go-to strategy, or a visible example of government intervention into the economy. Right now, we're all at home because of COVID-19, and we're hearing about these stimulus checks that the government is going to send out to each family. This is a priming the pump action. They're going to send money directly to the American people to try to keep the economy from descending into depression. Okay, there's many federal agencies that still exist today. So FDIC insurance, the Securities and Exchange Commission, Social Security. Okay, the farming techniques learned in the Great Depression are still used. So conservation that was practiced by the CCC is still in place. And I already mentioned, but the Social Security system is still in place today. And probably the largest thing is this expectation on the American people that government action is going to solve the major problems that we have. So we now look to our national government to solve our problems. Okay, and then there's also the New Deal coalition. So minorities, labor, etc., that become part of the Democratic Party long term. Okay, if we're looking at the effects of the New Deal in terms of finances, we can see this is gross public debt. So we can see here at the beginning of the 1930s to about 1940, there is an increase in public debt. But the larger increase in public debt comes as the US goes into World War II. So about 1939, 1940, that's where the US starts really spending in World War II, and we see a massive increase in debt from World War II. So if we were to cut this off, it would look like there was quite a lot of spending from the New Deal in relation to the debt before. But with World War II coming right after the Great Depression, it makes it look like it wasn't that much spending. If we're looking at deficits, this is where the government is spending more than it makes. We can see some spikes. The U.S. government deficit spent during World War I, and then it runs a surplus. And then you have the deficit spending of the New Deal right here, where my mouse is pointing. And then the deficit spending of World War II is this massive spike. And then we have a few spots where the U.S. runs a surplus, but deficit spending becomes the norm, right? Right here, this surplus right here is the presidency of Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton balanced the federal budget and actually ran a surplus, but presidents following him did not stick with his plan to balance the budget and run a surplus. Bill Clinton had a plan to start to deal with the federal debt, but then George W. Bush and the war on terror is where we began deficit spending again, and then this spike is the stimulus spending of the 2008 recession. So the U.S. government has become a deficit spender. And in terms of debt, this is what the US government debts look like today. So I'll leave it right here. And remember, we're looking at this New Deal. We're looking at how this impacts social and economic and political life over time. So I'll let you rewind and take a look back through that stuff. And then the next video we're going to be dealing with World War II. So I'll get that together for you all, and that'll be the last topic we need to know so that you can answer your APUSH test in about 5 weeks. So email me or let me know if you have any questions.